one fact that all of us can agree upon. It's an indisputable fact. And that is the fact of death. All of us in this room that are sat in front of us today, in 90 years' time, possibly even 75 years' time, none of us will be here. We will just be an echo in the memory. We probably won't even be remembered after 150 years. And so what we're going to talk about today is a reflection on death. There's a famous hadith, أَقْصِرُوا فِي الذِّكْرِ حَادِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ. Increase in your remembrance of the destroyer of the pleasures, the death. The reason why we really care about death is because it clarifies what is important. It clarifies that we are not إِنَّ لِلَّهِ عِبَادٌ فُتَنَا طَلَّقُوا الدُّنْيَا وَخَافُوا الْفِتَنَا نَظَرُوا فِيهَا فَلَمَّا عَرِفُوا إِنَّهَا لَيْسَتْ لِحَيٍّ وَطَنًا جَعَلُوهَا لُجَّةً وَاتَّخَذُوا صَالِحَ الْأَعْمَالِ فِيهَا سُفُنًا. There are some bright, intelligent servants of the Almighty. طَلَّقُوا الدُّنْيَا وَخَافُوا الْفِتَنَا. They divorce the dunya and they are fearful of the fitan. نَظَرُوا فِيهَا فَلَمَّا عَرِفُوا. When they looked into this world, they realized that إِنَّهَا لَيْسَتْ لِحَيٍّ وَطَنًا. This is not for the living people a permanent abode. And then, this is the light bulb moment. جَعَلُوهَا لُجَّةً وَاتَّخَذُوا صَالِحَ الْأَعْمَالِ فِيهَا سُفُنًا. They basically framed this dunya as an ocean. جَعَلُوهَا لُجَّةً وَاتَّخَذُوا صَالِحَ الْأَعْمَالِ فِيهَا سُفُنًا. And they made a ship upon that ocean their righteous deeds. And that is the frame. And this is the frame that Imam Shafi'i, the poem that I just recited, this is the frame that Imam Shafi'i put on the life and the death. And so what we are going to be talking about today is that transition, an important part of that transition over. So you've got a transition over which is the spiritual transition. You need to make sure that you know that when your deathbed is there, that you are ready to say the kalima. You need to know that when the angel of death comes, you are able to answer those questions appropriately. You need to make sure that you are carrying across your good deeds. So that's the spiritual part of the journey. But then there's also the economic and contractual part of the journey. You can't be that we are spiritually pure and we're turning up and we're doing salah 5 times a day, we've got our hijab or we've got our beards and we're doing our zakat and our fasting, and yet the very act that we leave the dunya with, we leave behind us in our wake a trail of destruction. That's not us looking after this migration over. So today that's what we're going to be talking about, inshallah. What we're going to be covering in the next couple of hours is first and foremost the why, and we've already started elaborating on that. And that's probably the most important thing. And after that, we'll get into some of the details, some of the nitty-gritty. We'll talk a little bit at a high level about the rules that the Sharia has laid out for Islamic inheritance. Now this, as the Sheikh rightly put, is a complicated subject, and it's not a subject that we're going to be able to cover in the allotted amount of time that we have here. But there is good news. And the good news is that actually the vast majority of those rules we can actually access online very quickly, and there are now actually calculators that can calculate the inheritance for you very accurately. I've seen some very good ones that Al-Maghrib offer. We've got one on the IFG website as well that you can very easily access. But then the second good news is that actually for the vast majority of people, we've done thousands and thousands of wills now for people, and for the vast majority of people there are only a small number of important rules, because for the vast majority of people they only have some of the key people that will inherit, and that's it. So that's what we will go through to give you a framework to think about. And then we'll go into the practicalities of what is an Islamic will in this country. What is an Islamic will in the UK? Because when we talk about inheritance, when we talk about Islamic law, we can't do that if we're not going to be talking about the law itself. Because if we divorce it from that, it may not actually be binding. It may not actually be able to be affected. And the other key aspect to all of this, when we're talking about finances and money, is about tax and how we should be managing our affairs around tax and estate planning as well. So we'll talk a little bit about all of that. And then finally, to be honest, I might throw in some of these stories as we go along, just to keep things fresh, but also because it's a sobering reminder of what happens when you don't get your affairs in order. I mean, out of interest, who in here has heard of a horror story about wills and inheritance and people having fights in the family as a result of them not having a will? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. And can I see a show of hands, in whose extended family they have actually seen this in their brothers, sisters, cousins, family, uncles, etc. Yeah. So there's quite a few people in this room who will bear the mental scars of what happens when things go wrong. And it's one of those things where it's all fun and games. It's like when you don't have car insurance. It's all fun and games until the police pulls you over, and then you're really messed up. So let's begin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ. Every soul shall taste death. And the very first thing that we want to make sure that we are doing here, we should purify our intention. We're not turning up here because we want to, just reduce our tax, for example. We're turning up here because there's famous hadith about how Rasulullah, he says that the heart gets rusted. The heart gets this rust over it. And the way that you reduce that rust on the heart is by increasing in tilawah of the Quran and by remembering death. And so what we are doing here is a deeply spiritual activity where we are looking to try and cleanse our heart, and we're trying to focus on what matters. And then of course the second thing is, and I won't ask for a show of hands here, but there are probably many in this room who don't have a will. There are probably many in this room who don't have a will. Most people actually, just over 50% of people in the country don't have a will. And yet we have this hadith by Rasulullah ﷺ that says that you should not let 2 nights pass without having something written down if you have money and affairs to bequeath. That's the severity, and that's the emphasis that has been placed on this action. And then the other key and important part of this, and there's another hadith about how a man may do good deeds for 70 years, but if he acts unjustly when he leaves his last testament, the wickedness of his deed will be sealed upon him, and he will enter the fire. And a man may act wickedly for 70 years, but just in his last will and testament, the goodness of his deed will be sealed upon him, and he will enter the garden. So this moment that we're talking about is a very delicate moment. It's a very critical moment, and we all pray and we hope that when that moment comes for us, it's a moment where we are stepping up and we're doing the right thing. And I'll share with you a story about my father-in-law. He, alhamdulillah, he's still with us, but he had a stroke a few years ago, and twice they put him on DNR, which is do not resuscitate, and you basically go and see him, and this is his last time that you'll see him. And I remember that we were trying to do talqeen, where you try and encourage him to do the shahada, la ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and he was not only doing that, but because he has studied for so long, and he's one of the contemporaries of people like Sheikh Sohaib Hassan and others like that. And he's a scholar. He was actually telling us and finishing the hadith off about the talqeen. And he was teaching us other things about the kalima la ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And so, I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us that, a death like that, even though he didn't even die at that point. But I saw, when that moment comes, what you live like for the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, it all comes up at that moment. And for him, this was natural. For him, this was normal. And so that's what came gushing forth. And so part of that is also the inheritance and the will. That's one thing that really should be sorted before we get to our deathbed. And because there's rules around that as well, because once you get to your deathbed, you can't really be changing things anyway. And so when we want to get to our deathbed, and when we want to pass over and stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to make sure that the very first thing that we are doing when we turn up is a good thing, and not something that's going to be a cause of wickedness for us. And if you don't have a will, that will be an issue for you in the UK, because what is actually then happening is that you are dying and your affairs will be settled not by the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but by the laws of this government, HMRC. And your inheritance, the very first act that you take into the akhirah, the very first act that you take into your eternal life will be off from the wrong footing. So it's really important we get this right. Before I dive into some of the Sharia rules that I will do very shortly, with Islamic wills, it's not just about who gets what. In this country, it's also about whether or not you get cremated, whether or not you want to donate your organs or not. And all of these additional factors come into it. And you might think, well, look, I've got a family, it'll be perfectly fine, there's absolutely no issues whatsoever. And then COVID hits. And then when you die, or where your mom or your dad or your uncle dies, there's no one there around them. And the thing that they look at to figure out if someone should be cremated or not is partly the will. What is actually written down on that piece of paper. And we don't know where we're going to die. None of us know that. My grandfather was born in Delhi, in India. He migrated to Rawalpindi, and then Lahore, and then Karachi, and then he came over to us in England, and he's buried now in a small town in the northeast, Stockton-on-Tees. When he was born in Delhi, he didn't think he was going to end up in Stockton-on-Tees. And none of us know where we're going to pass away as well. So what we can do and get right is get that piece of paper sorted, so that when it comes to those key issues, that we are getting ahead of the curve. And I'll share at this point one of those stories that I wanted to mention. And this is from my own family again, where you had a wealthy businessman, and he set up multiple factories, and he's, alhamdulillah, they did very well. Then he passed away, and he had 3 sons. And those sons, one of them took over one of the businesses in Lahore, and the other one took over the businesses in Karachi. But then these sons, and at this point, very key moment, there were daughters, and the daughters didn't get anything. So it was all in limbo. They kind of got a stipend, but they didn't actually get anything in the business. And then these brothers, they all had sons, many of them. And so they then got involved within the business. And the 2 brothers in Karachi, they had sons and daughters as well. And it was a messy situation But with one generation, it was okay. They all roughly, got along. But then we had one of the brothers pass away unexpectedly. And that's when things got really complicated. And so without going into all of the details, it's got to the point now where we are in court battles, where the family members are having to go around with armed guards because it's got that serious. It's got to the point where, you've got marriages between the warring factions, shall we say. You've actually got intermarriage between them, and yet there are deep, deep rifts within that family such that they're not talking to each other. And all of that traces back down to one decision. And that was the lack of an Islamic distribution at the point when that person died and passed away the first time. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that when someone passes away who's a businessman or woman, they need to sell up all of their business. That's not what it means. But what it means is that you need to get the paperwork right. You need to make sure that it's clear, absolutely crystal clear, who actually owns what. And I know it's a difficult conversation to have at times. I do these Friday calls where anyone can book in for 10 minutes for a call with me. And I was having a conversation yesterday with someone, and often it's the same kind of thing, which is that we all know deep down what is the right thing. And we know that we need to have that conversation with our brother or our sister or our mother or our father about who actually owns this house. That, so it's a really vital, critical conversation. It's often around a family home. Who owns this house? What percentage exactly? Because I'm contributing in perhaps, or someone has got the mortgage in their name, someone's got the house in their name, someone is covering the bills, and everyone thinks that they've got a certain portion of their house. Everyone thinks they own half of the house, but there's 4 of them. So how's that going to work? And so it's really important, if you take nothing else away from this conversation, from this talk, take this away, that if you're in that situation where there is ambiguity about any asset, it could be with a business partner, it could be with your spouse, it could be with your parents, it could be with your brothers and sisters, have that conversation. Because it will be hard, and it might be that it causes friction at that point. It might be that there's tears and there's raised voices and someone leaves the room. Of course, you should try and avoid that. But believe you me, that conversation had then between 2 people who actually know each other will save the conversation happening in a decade or 2 decades time when you 2 are long gone. And then there's 4 or 5 other people who don't know each other, and then you end up in a courtroom. Or then you end up, splitting up the family. So have that conversation. Okay. Let's dive into some rules around the Sharia. So there's some key people who pretty much always show up in an Islamic inheritance calculation. You've got the husband and the wife, you've got the father and the mother, and then you've got the children, the sons and the daughters. They're usually the key people. And this is what I said, 97% of all wills, it's just an allocation between these different parties. And the Quran talks about there are verses in the Quran, 3 key verses that talk of exactly what's going to happen. And without going into the details of all of the verses and all of the edge cases, the key things that you need to remember are the husband will get a half, or if there is children, then the husband will get a quarter. The wife will get a quarter, but if there's children, then she will end up getting 1/8. The father will get 1/6 if there's children, or he will get the remaining amount after everything has been sorted. And so an example where that might occur is where there is a daughter and then there is a wife, and then the father, there's a daughter and a mother, and then the father gets the remaining amount. And then you've got the mother, and she will either get 1/3 or she will get 1/6. And then the children, it's 2-to-1. And I'll give you a worked example of this to make it a little bit more obvious. For the children, it's 2-to-1. So the male gets twice that of the female. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the hikmah behind that and some of the thought processes and issues that one might need to think about when thinking through that. So that, in a nutshell, is the inheritance that we have. And I'll give you now a live example of this. So my grandfather passed away many years on my mom's side, and he left behind him, how many do we have? We have three sons and 2 daughters and a wife. So you run the calculation, and to be honest, for most of you, the easiest thing to do is just go online and look at an Islamic inheritance calculator that is reliable and trustworthy, and just punch in the numbers, and that will give you the answer. And if you're confused and you've got some complicated situation, then you might want to run that by a mufti as well. That's the simplest practical way to do this. So you don't need to worry, at this conversation about, oh no, I need to now know about, the ilm of wiratha and, how it's all going to be split up. But coming back to the scenario, so we've got the wife, and we've got 3 sons, and we've got 2 daughters. So this is actually a very classic kind of situation that you face. And so what you ask is first, so it's the man has passed away, so does he have a wife? Yes, he does. Does he have children? Yes, he does. So he gets, what does he get? Go on. Any answers? Well, what does the wife get? 1/8. Fantastic. So the wife gets 1/8. Is there a father? There's no father. Is there a mother? There's no mother. But there are children, and there's 5 of them, and there's 3 boys and there's 2 girls. And so what you would do is you would say, okay, so each of these boys get 2 portions, so 2, 4, 6, and then you go 7 and 8. So you've got 8 in there. And so what is left of the estate? What is left of the estate is 7/8 of the estate is what's left. So what you now need to do is divide 7/8 by another 1/8. So it becomes 14/16. Yeah? And then of that 14, you can then distribute it according to each of those portions. So it's basically taking that 7/8 and dividing it by the amounts that the kids all need to get. It'll take a little bit of maths, but you can work it out yourself quite easily. Actually, let's just do it so that it's like a practical example of it. So what have we got? We have got, so let's say it's £100,000. So of that £100,000, you divide that by 8 and you get 12,500. So now you've got 87,500 left. So let's write that down. 87,500, and then you know that is going to be divided 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 between 8 people. So you divide that by 8 and you get £10,937 50, and so then that is the amount that each daughter will get, and then you times that by 2 and you get 21,875, and that is the amount that each son will get, and that's it. It's as simple as that. And for the vast majority of people, this is basically the scenario that you're looking at. Okay, so I won't go into the detail of this particular inheritance table, but I'm flagging it up here for the purposes of everyone understanding that there's lots of additional rules and there's lots of additional things that one needs to think about, particularly when one gets beyond the 5 or 6 people that I've mentioned. Once one gets beyond the husband and the wife, and the father and the mother and the son and the daughter, after that, it needs to be thought about quite carefully. And at the heart of it, it's about, it goes down in chains. So if, for example, there would have been an allocation to the, to the father or the mother, you look at actually, is someone going to block that? So there's a lot of thinking around blocking that goes into it. And then eventually, it flows down and looks at the sons and the daughters, and if there's no son, then you look at the son's son, etc., etc. But you don't need to worry about this, as I said, too much. And easiest thing in the world is to use a calculation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the common questions that we often get. The first question is, why does the son get more? Or why does the husband get more? Or why does the father, in some scenarios, end up getting more? And so the answer to that is that actually in many cases, there are many cases where the wife, or there's many cases where the mother can actually end up with more, or the women can end up with more. So it's not actually clear cut, that's always the case. But yes, in many cases, in the majority of cases, in the kind of situations that we face, the son does often end up with more. And the reason for that is really quite simple, and that is that the son, or the men in Islam, have a duty of qiwama, they have a duty of looking after their families. They actually have an obligation on their wealth to look after their wives, their children, their mothers, their sisters who perhaps may not have a guardian. All of them have to be looked after by the men of the household. And so this is why there is this additional obligation, this additional amount that is given to the son. And so it's really important that we don't pick and choose in this though, because sometimes people can try and oppress people using this, where the son is quite happy to take double the portion, but they're not happy to do the work that is commensurate to that. He's not happy to actually make the contributions and look after his family after he's been given that wealth. And that's something that is on the son, but it's also something that needs to be part of the conversation when talking about inheritance. And this is what I mean about having those difficult conversations, because at the heart of it, the sharia has the rules, but the rules are implemented and enlivened through the behaviors of the Muslimin when they behave and they interact with each other. And so if we're not actually going to have those conversations, then the rules in themselves are just a rule book. We need to actually look about how we implement them. The second question we often get is, what happens to non-Muslim relatives? So with non-Muslim relatives, in the mirath, in the inheritance, Muslims don't, as a starting point, inherit from non-Muslims, and non-Muslims don't, as a starting point, inherit from Muslims. And so if you do happen to have someone in your family who is not a Muslim, the actual laws of inheritance, the obligated things that you should be giving to someone, they don't apply to that person, and it is as if they don't count on when you're doing the calculation. However, you do have the 1/3. So Islam allows you to give 1/3 freely to whomever you will. So you could give it to charity, and we often see that when people do wills. You could give it to friends and family who otherwise weren't going to get any inheritance. You could give it to your non-Muslim relatives. You can even, and this is with the consent of everyone else, you can even top up some of the other inheritors. But if you do that, then everyone needs to agree with that. So if, for example, in my grandfather's case, the daughters they weren't very well off, and the sons were very well off, for example. And so the agreement that they may have wanted to come to is that actually we want to give a little bit more to the daughters, and is that okay? Only the daughters and the sons and the mother coming together and all of them consenting to that would actually allow for that to happen. Do you see? Because if you decide unilaterally to make that decision, then you are going against the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if, for example, my grandfather had written in his estate that actually I want 1/3 of it, I want half of that 1/3, so 1/6 extra, I want to go to these two daughters. He can only do that if all of the inheritors agree. That's not his unilateral right to do that. He can't also, by the way, cut out someone from the inheritance, regardless of how much they may dislike them, or regardless of how much hurt they may have caused them, or regardless of if they are estranged, or whatever the case might be. They can't do that. This is not our right that we are dealing with. This is now the money of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we pass away, it isn't our money any longer. The laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are applied to it, and then they are allocated according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What happens if you've got a non-Muslim relative who passes away? For example, you're a convert to Islam and your mother may be a non-Muslim and she passes away. In that scenario, it is worth talking to a mufti, because they can sometimes, given your specific circumstances, give different answers. But at the very minimum, they will typically allow you to keep at least 1/3 of that estate. And it's the same principle is applying, which is that in Islam, the Muslim gets about 1/3 of their estate as a free allocation. And so they apply, by analogy, the same ruling to a non-Muslim's estate, and they say you can keep 1/3 of it. However, if the 2/3 of it is otherwise going to end up with the government, then it doesn't make any sense to give it to the government. And so this is where the mufti can come in, and they can help guide you as to what is the best situation, what is the best step for you to take in this situation. And they may either guide you to give it away to charity, or they may potentially guide you that it might be a good idea to take it and distribute it to XYZ people. But that's a question for you and the mufti to have in that particular circumstance. So we've already covered that you can potentially top up your beneficiaries with your 1/3 that you have to play with, but you need the consent of everyone. Now another question comes up, which is, do you need to use that 1/3? And the answer is no. You don't need to use the 1/3. And in fact, the whole hadith around thuluth, the hadith goes on, is وَالثُّلُث كَثِيرٌ, that even 1/3 that you want to give away to charity is a lot. So Rasulullah ﷺ was encouraging the majority of the estate to actually go to the family, because they have the first right. So it's an optional thing. We can use the 1/3, and perhaps, mashallah, maybe some of us have a lot of money, and it would make sense to give a 1/3 of it away, or a 20% of it away. But if you don't have a huge estate, and especially thinking practically now, these days, where the younger generation, the Gen Zs and the Gen, I don't know what they call them these days, the Gen Alpha, they find it really hard, A, to concentrate, but B, to get onto the housing ladder. And that's because of the way that the economy is today, where houses have become more and more expensive because of inflation, because we've debased our currency. And so those of us who might be in their 50s or 60s and 70s, we may have got onto the housing ladder when it was cheap, and we may have amassed wealth as a result of that. And it would make sense for us to now try and help out our Gen Z or our Gen Alpha or our younger offspring. And so that's something that we need to think about if we've got a smaller estate, where we might us giving away a third of it to Islamic Relief or a third of it to whatever charity is a good deed, but is it actually, the best deed? Or is it a good deed where we're not actually thinking about the responsibility that we have around us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا أَنفَقُوا لَمْ يُسْرِفُوا وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا وَكَانَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. Those, when they spend, and this is talking about Ibad al-Rahman, the servants of Ar-Rahman that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves. He says, وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا أَنفَقُوا when they spend, when they give charity, لَمْ يُسْرِفُوا, they don't have israf, they don't go crazy on it. وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا, and they're not miserly either. وَكَانَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. But they are between that, in the middle, and they are balanced in their approach. The other thing that is important with the distribution is debts come out first. So before all of this conversation starts, if there are certain debts that this person has to pay, then they really need to be paid off first. And this could then lead to the conversation about, well, what about a mortgage? Well, the mortgage is a debt. And that's a conversation now between you and the bank, or possibly the Islamic bank, where you need to ask them, like, am I okay to step into the shoes of the person who was previously paying off the mortgage? Or how do we deal with this? And so either the bank will say, look, you've got a certain amount of time where you can pay this off, or you've got a certain amount of time where you can step in and you can carry on and you can continue paying the mortgage. And so we need to think about the debts very carefully, and it needs to be done in a fair way, because that debt is going to hang around the death of the neck of the deceased until it's paid off. It's something that just stays with them, and it's an obligation that they have to fulfill, that you as their inheritors should help them fulfill by getting those debts paid off. And you should ask in the local masjid, or you should ask in the local community that so-and-so has passed away, did he owe anything to anyone? To make sure that you find that out. And by the way, this practical stuff is why a will and writing it all down is so important. Because I want you to have a think about your own affairs. Just have a think about your own affairs. What assets do you own? What accounts do you have? What money do you have? What property do you have? What land in some far-off country do you have? And does someone in your family actually know about all of those things? Would they, if you just keeled over tomorrow, be easily able to figure out where all of this stuff is? And I can guarantee you the answer to that is no. And it's not that I'm just saying that, it's because there are literally billions and billions of pounds that are sat unclaimed in this country and have been for several decades. Because people lose money when they pass away. Money just goes missing. That land that was in Pakistan that you bought, no one knows about it. And in the case of Pakistan, probably someone has built on top of it as well. And it's gone forever. Or that account that you've set up a direct debit to, that you're paying into, does your spouse or your children know that? Or do they know the account and do they know the access to that? Or you may even have a will. You may be ahead of 50% of the population. You may have a will. But does your will have all of those details in there? And are you actually getting it out once a year, twice a year, and just kind of refreshing the logins and the access and the kind of things that people need to be looking at? Because that will be a very material benefit for your children or whoever's dealing with your estate after you pass away. Very material benefit. And then the other key aspect to this is businesses. Hands up who's got a limited company or a business. Okay, so there's a few with their hands up. Now you need to think about that very carefully. How are you going to navigate that? When you pass away, it's not obvious, it's not always the case that you need to sell up. You can actually continue a business as well. But what you do need to do is be clear, crystal clear, as to the shares that you own. And business is one of those things where sometimes we put it off. You know, the paperwork, we put it off right till the end, and we don't think about the issuance of shares. We don't think about the shareholders agreement. We don't think about, okay, we're kind of splitting it 50-50 amongst us, or 30-40, or whatever it is that we're splitting it at the moment. But what are the actual shares, and what does a legal paperwork actually say? Because it might be clear in your heads right now, but when both of you have dementia at the age of 80 or 90, one of you's passed away, and then there's like 6 kids in the picture, who neither of whom have been that involved in the business, they're not going to know what's going on. So prioritize getting that stuff right. And this is an injunction from the Quran as well. The Quran says that if you are going to make a transaction, the longest verse in the Quran is actually the verses about getting a shaheed, getting a witness, getting 1 or 2 witnesses to actually witness your transaction, writing stuff down, getting the katib to write down exactly what has been agreed. So this is something that we should be doing anyway. And so if you've got a business and you're inheriting that, you need to think about, who's inheriting what? Is it assets or is it shares? And this should all be part of your inheritance. But then secondly, with a business, what you need to be thinking about is who's actually going to run this thing. Right? Because a business is not just shares, usually where you're a passive shareholder. A business is an active thing. And so do you have an agreement, or do you have an understanding with you and your business partner, you and your spouse, as to what's going to happen if the 2 of you are running a shop, and one of you die and your business partner is left? Half of the workload that used to be taking place is now not being taken up. So what happens next? So this is not a conversation that Islam can tell you specifically what to do, but this is a common sense conversation that Islam can give you the principles around and encourage you to have. So very important that we get on top of that. And then the final thing is that in some madhahib, particularly the Hanafi madhab, they have a concept of kafara as well. So if you've missed certain prayers, or if you've missed certain siyam, then they say that you can put aside, and this is some in the Hanafi madhab would say that. So that's something for you to look into. I was actually trying to recall what the exact kafara is, and I couldn't recall it. There's a specific amount, and it has a specific value at whatever time it is that you pass away, and so you can give that away as well as a kafara for missed salahs and missed siyam, etc. My personal view is that rather than kafara, it's better to of course give to charity, but then catch up in your lifetime and be on a program of catching up. Okay, so we have another worked example before we get into some of the details around Islamic wills in practice. So Hussein, he's passed away. He's got a wife, he's got 2 sons, both of his parents are still alive. Islamically, his inheritors would be his wife, his 2 sons, and his mother and his father. His brother doesn't get anything. His sister doesn't get anything. His great-grandmother doesn't get anything. His sons, they don't get anything. It's just these people, because they've blocked anyone else further down the chain. Anyone want to hazard a guess? What would the wife get? 1/8. Brilliant. What would the father get? 1/6. Great. What would the mother get? 1/6 again. Correct. So yeah, 1/3 would be if there wasn't children, from memory now. So you've got 1/8, 1/6, 1/6, and then what do the sons get? Yeah, so they get basically half of what is remaining after that. So here we have the actual calculation. So 1/8 is the wife, the father gets 1/6, the mother gets 1/6, and then the sons both get half of what is remaining. So what have you got? We've got 1/8, 1/6, so 22, yeah, 26, I think is 13/48 is what they're getting. Let me just check that. What's that? Exactly, correct. Yeah, absolutely. So 1/3, if he's decided to give 1/3 to UK Islamic Mission or a masjid, then that goes out immediately, and then on the remaining, they work it out like this. So that's how it would work. And so in this case, the denominator would be 48. So then you get 6, 6/48, and you get 8/48 for the father and the mother, 6/48 for the wife, and then for the two sons you get 23. Is it 23? What it is? Or 16, sorry. No. 26, yeah, 26. Yeah, that's right. So then they get 13 each. And don't worry if you're thinking, oh my days, I didn't concentrate in GCSE maths, I don't know what's going to happen here. I might die doing this. That's where the calculators come in. The calculators are really quite helpful. I don't know if I can share my screen and show you an example of a calculator, but let me give it a go, see what happens. I might get in trouble for this, I don't know if it's possible. So I think this is a very nice calculator. I don't know, can you see this on the screen? Okay, fine. Oh, maybe you can. You can, yeah? So this is a nice calculator. That's inheritance.ilmsummit.org. We've got one as well, but for ours, you need to actually get into the tool itself, the wills tool, and then it helps you write the will, but it also works it out. So I won't use that for now. And here you can see, okay, so he has one wife, he's got two sons, he's got a father, he's got a mother, and then you can calculate your inheritance, and then there you see the outcomes. So it's quite a nice, easy one, and it shows you the steps as well, and it shows you the rules that they are using as well. And yeah, so it's quite helpful for analysis. Okay, so hopefully it will come back. Okay, great. So now that we've covered off the Islamic side, so to speak, let's get into the legal side of this conversation. So a will is a legal document that sets out what's going to happen after you pass away. It's going to tell people what's going to happen to your assets, what's going to happen to your children, what's going to happen to your body after you die. It needs to be executed in writing, so it can be typed up, that's perfectly fine, but it needs to be signed by wet ink signature. Like, you actually need a pen to sign it. It's one of those laws or one of those rules in the UK law where, unlike most other contracts, a will actually needs a wet ink signature. And it needs not just a wet ink signature, but it needs two witnesses to actually witness the signing of this document as well. And these two witnesses, they can't be beneficiaries of the will. So I'll go over all of that again. This is vital, because if you get this wrong, you put all this effort to do a will, and it won't be binding after that. So what you need to do, you need to print it out, you need to sign it with a pen, and whilst you're signing it, two people need to be witnesses to that signature. Those two people, they should be adults, they should be sane, and crucially, they should not be people who are going to benefit from your will. So for example, we had Hussein who passed away. His sons couldn't be witnesses to his will because they are beneficiaries. They are going to get money from that will, so they can't be signatories. And if he does that, that's a problem. Inshallah, we'll cover questions at the end. But if you write it down, then we can keep on top of it. So that's key rule number 1. Key rule number 2 is people sometimes think that if I've got this online will done and I got it as a PDF or something and it's in my inbox, that's good enough. It's not good enough. You actually need to print it off and sign it and get it witnessed by the right people. People also think that once the will is signed, I need to do something with it. I need to give it to a solicitor. I need to put it in a frame, or I need to do something with it. You just need to keep it in a safe place. That will, dated, put it in a safe, put it in where the place where you put all your passports. Yeah, put it there so that everyone knows that this is your important documents section, and that's where they will find it. What about if you have multiple wills? Well, if you have multiple wills, the will that is the last will is going to take precedence over everything else. And for clarity's sake, you should probably burn up or just tear up your old wills as well, so that people don't get confused about it. If you're going to be making changes to the will, specifically as to who gets what, then you should rewrite the will. Rather than making annotations on the will, the document itself, you should print it off afresh and with the new allocations there. At the back of a will, or at least some wills, for example, the will template that we use at IFG, there is a list of assets that you can have and you can put in there. That you don't necessarily need to, you can update it and you can swap it in and out on a yearly basis, because that's not part of the actual will. Because the assets, they will change over time. That's perfectly fine. But the percentages that you're going to give to everyone, that, if you're going to change that, that's a new will. And then at the back of the will, you can also have your messages to your loved ones, your nasiyah, your guidance to them, your password logins, all of that stuff can be put into the messages at the section at the back. This, again, is not a core part of the will. You can change that and replace it without, making the whole thing null and void. So key things are all that comes before the signature page. If anything is changed there, then you need to do it again. After that, you can have a little bit more of a free rein on it. And in my mind, this is a practical thought now. In my mind, there are basically 3 wills that a human being should do during the course of their life. The first of those, you can probably just use a free will template. So there's some really good free will templates. We've got an article that links you to the free will templates online at the moment, and that you can access. And this is ideal for people who are perhaps unmarried still, or don't have that many assets. So a free will template is quite effective for people like that. And I did a free will many, many years ago. Then the next logical point where I think it makes sense to pay a bit of money now to actually get a will done, and there's people like iWill solicitors, Saracen solicitors, Farani tailors, IFG, and there's probably a few others. If you just Google it, you'll find it. When you get married, or you buy your first house, or you may have your first child, at that point you've got some things that are now floating around where it's worth you getting an expert to look at your document to make sure that it's right. And that will probably cost you about 100, 200, maybe 300 pounds. That's roughly the cost of these things. And top tip, you can actually, so we, at IFG, we do the wills for people like Islamic Relief, Muslim Hands, Muslim Aid, NZF, and many others. And so you can actually get a free will from these charities, but if you do that, you then, of course, the reason why they're offering these free wills is because they want to encourage people to donate to the charity as well, either on the day or in their estate. So, that's a top tip for getting a relatively free will sorted, but you should of course then, not take advantage of that either and, do give charity. And then the final type of will that you get done, and this may not necessarily apply to you ever, but for many people it can apply, and that is when you get a little bit older and you might have a property, 2 properties, you might have a fair amount of assets now, maybe you've got your pension in as well. And at that point, you might be thinking that, okay, I'm now getting to the point where I need to think about my inheritance tax. If you are getting into that 325,000 plus range, or 500,000 plus range, that kind of range, where your net worth is above that, then it is helpful for you to go for what's called a trust-based will. So this is just a fancy word for a will that is has tax planning built into it. And so that's the third kind of will that you get, and you can typically get that will, we offer it for £348, but you can get it in a number of other places as well, all of these solicitors firms that I mentioned. And in fact, if you've got a larger estate, so now we're talking perhaps in the several millions of pounds, then it's probably worth you going to a tax advisor at the same time and actually thinking about the specific trust structures that you might want to put in place today in order to manage for your inheritance tax in a few years' time. So if we reiterate all of what I just said there, free will for anyone who is young, carefree, and doesn't have that many assets. A simple, very cheap will for people probably between the ages of 25 to about 40-ish, 35, 40-ish, when you might have a little bit of assets, you might have kids, but you don't have a huge amount. And then a trust-based will or a more advanced will, if and when your assets start exceeding that inheritance tax threshold. And at that point, you should probably get some more specialist advice. And the reason why it's important to step through these ranks is because inheritance tax today is 40%, which is a lot. It's a big chunk of money. So you work all of your life, and then if you don't plan it properly, you give 40% of it to HMRC, who you've been trying to avoid. I know certainly the people in Greater Manchester have been trying to avoid HMRC for much of their lives. So you don't want the HMRC to have the last laugh. And so that's why it's important to think about that last step. I've already mentioned that if your affairs are, you've not put an Islamic will in place, then your estate will be settled according to the laws of intestacy, which is the laws of the UK government when it comes to the distribution of assets for someone who doesn't have a will. And actually, if you're a practicing religious family and everyone is on board with, we need to do this Islamically, and my father passed away and he didn't have an Islamic will, and then what we're going to do is we're going to sort it out amongst ourselves, then it can still be done, right? So it's not completely the end of the world. But if you don't have everyone that is playing ball, and you do have, the black sheep of the family who is quite happy to, go with whichever rules will give him or her the most amount of money, then you've got a bit of a problem. Because without the Islamic will, the laws of intestacy are what will apply. And then you've got a bit of a conflict. So it's important to make sure that, we don't get into that situation. Interestingly enough, by the way, English law is very versatile in the sense that you can actually, if you put a will in place, not an Islamic will, just any will, you can actually decide that you want to cut out lots of people from your will and give pretty much to anywhere that you like. And this is why you see those crazy stories of how Battersea Dogs Home ends up with multi-million-pound donations on a will, and the kids are all roaming around, and they're not as well looked after as the mongrel in Battersea Dogs Home. And The other interesting thing about this, this is where I think it is useful for us as a community to start thinking about long-term donations and long-term awqaf. The interesting thing is that charity, hands up who's heard of Macmillan Cancer Relief. So Macmillan Cancer Relief gets over 50% of its donations today, and it's a multi-million pound charity, one of the largest charities in the UK, gets over 50% of its donations today via bequests, via money that is left to it in its inheritance. And alhamdulillah, I think some of the charities that we've been working with, some particularly I have to say Islamic Relief, have been very on top of this. And they've actually built up now bequests that are in the tens of millions, north of 30-40 million pounds, just because people give away chunks of their estate, 5%, 10%, but if it's 5 or 10% of 500,000, that's a big donation. And for each of us as individuals, we need to think about how is it that we can keep our sadaqah jariyah going? How is it that we can think about our ummah and our offspring long after we're passed away? Because we only have 80, 90 years on this earth. But what if we could put our money and efforts to work for thousands of years, earning that reward? We've never even met these people, and on the Day of Judgment they turn up and they're saying to us, and this is now the year 2700, and they're turning up to us and they're telling us that they benefited from the money that we put aside, and it helped them buy their hovercraft or whatever it is that they do in 2700. How amazing would that be? We've got the awqaf of people like Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, which is very famous, and there's still buildings in Medina that are funded by the Waqf of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. So he passed away over 1400 years ago, and yet his money is still earning him a reward to this day. And really, وَالْبَاقِيَاتُ الصَّالِحَاتُ, the things that remain are the good deeds and the sadaqah jariyah. And of course our kids are a vital part of that. But then it's also about our wealth. And we genuinely don't have that much time on this earth. And on the flip side, what are the enemies of Islam doing? What are the bad guys doing? Well, I can tell you what the bad guys are doing. They've got huge endowments that are putting that money to work to nefarious means and ends against Islam. And perhaps these are not the bad guys, but to give you vivid examples of this, my college at university, Brasenose College, where people like David Cameron and others studied, when I went there, it had an endowment of, I think it was about 200 million. And it wasn't the richest Oxford college by any stretch, by the way. It had an endowment of 100 million at that point. The richest college at that point had, I think, 250 million. Now, after 14, 15 years have gone by, I checked recently again, and its endowment is now over 200 million. Just because it's all mounted up. And what is 1% of 200 million? 1% of 200 million is 2 million. 2 million is a huge amount of money, and they were probably going to be making 5% income from that at the very least. So they're making about 10 million pounds from that 200 million every single year in perpetuity. And a chunk of that is going to be reinvested into the endowment, it's going to increase it. The Church of England has churches shutting down left, right and center, but its endowment is around the 10 billion pound mark. So, I sometimes chuckle to myself where I think all of these masajid that are, struggling to raise money and, we're trying to keep the heating on, etc., etc., and then the Church of England is shutting down its churches but it has the money, and we're struggling. But what if that was flipped? What if our awqaf were actually so strong that they could be contributing to the strength of the masajid and the Muslim community for centuries to come? And the thing is, this stuff takes time. Like these Oxford endowments or the Harvard endowments, they started several hundred years ago in some cases. There's a library, and there was this whole hoo-ha, I don't know if you guys remember, but there was a hoo-ha about the people who funded Oxford University, and there's a lot of slave owners in that. And I remember there was a library opposite my college, and it was called the Codrington Library. And this guy, Codrington, he was a major plantation owner in the slave era in the West Indies. And so that money came back and it funded that library. And so it's been going, this money has been filtering through, and for centuries it's been strengthening certain institutions. And funnily enough, I actually ended up in a tutorial. So in Oxford you have two people to a tutor. So it's very, intimate. And they can do that because they've got all these £10 million endowments knocking around. So they can actually fund it. And his surname was Codrington. And he was actually one of the descendants of this person. And so that's how other people think about their wealth. That's how other people think about supporting their communities, not just for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but for hundreds of years. And that's what we should be thinking about as well when it comes to our inheritance. Okay, I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so I'll carry on, and then we'll get into all of the Q&A. Maybe at this point I'll share a story. So this is from another line of my family, and this is now from the Punjabi side of the family. And unfortunately in Punjab, well, not unfortunately, but fortunately I guess in Punjab you've got lots of land, farmland in particular. And the way that it works often is that the daughters are cut out of the inheritance. And so in this particular situation, you had the daughters, the father, he knew what was the right thing to do, but he still didn't give the daughters their due. And so what ended up happening was that the men of the family, and they can be quite overpowering sometimes, because they think that this is my livelihood. And so rather than distributing it fairly, they say, no, we'll take it and we'll look after it as well. And in those societies or in those circumstances, and it can happen here as well, by the way, where you might have a large business and the man says, no, the son says, I'll look after it for everyone. But the son is not being just, and the son, when you've put him in charge of this huge amount of wealth, there are hundreds of ways that he can benefit more than he can distribute out. And so that's what ended up happening here. And then eventually it echoed through time again. So the uncle who was the unjust uncle, or the son who was the unjust son, he had kids, and then they did exactly the same thing. And the uncle or the son, he may have given some money to his daughters, to his sisters, but then when the kids come in, they don't even have that relationship. And so then it goes completely away. But then they're now having the same struggle. And the daughters who are now the aunties, they're saying to them that forget us, we're fine, and you've done what you've done, and we've forgiven it. But now in your generation, where you've got a daughter, you've got 2 daughters, and you've got sons, don't do the same thing. Make sure that you give them their due. And so that's another live situation where it causes frictions and it causes disputes in families and in societies. And so this is one of those where all of us, we might be in that situation ourselves, or we might have family in Pakistan where this is particularly common, that would be thinking along these lines. And we should get ahead of that, and we should tell them that this is haram, this is impermissible, you are stealing. That's what you're doing. You are stealing and taking someone else's haqq. You are taking someone else's due. And just like we think very badly of someone who has been caught thieving, that is how we should think about someone who is taking unjustly from their own relatives. Okay, so let's get into some of the practical benefits of having a will. The first of those is, if you've got children under the age of 18, then they will need a guardian when you pass away. So if, God forbid, you and your spouse both are in a car accident or something like that, and you leave behind you children, then you can put in your will exactly who you would like to entrust with looking after and raising your children. And that's a big trust. That's possibly the biggest trust that you're giving to anyone. The other thing that I haven't mentioned here, talking about trusts, is that you have normally what are called executors or trustees of the will. And what this means is that if you pass away, you will have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people, typically we recommend 2 people that are reliable, trustworthy, that you have put in charge of executing your will. What all that means is they're the ones who are doing the running around, talking to people, doing the distributions. They're going to get access to the money. They're going to do all the legal work, all of that stuff. So it's a big responsibility, but it's also a responsibility that needs trust. And your trustees or executors, whatever you want to call them, let's call them executors, they can be beneficiaries. So your executors can be, for example, the children or your spouse. They can be that. So unlike the witnesses that can't be the beneficiaries, your executors, the people who are going to actually implement the will and are named in the will as executors, they can be the beneficiaries. Is that clear? Okay. We've already talked about making sure that you list out all of your assets and your estate so that it makes it easy for people to find out exactly what's going on. And what we actually recommend is every year when you do your zakat calculation, because when you do your zakat calculation, you're actually going to be listing out all of your assets in one place. What you should do is print that out and then put a date on it and attach it to the back of your will. So then that way you can keep a track of your assets on a yearly basis. And you remember to do it because once a year you do your zakat, and you can print that off and you can put it down. We've actually got a zakat calculator that's free to use on our website that allows you to populate it with all of the different assets that you have. And so you can use that, and then there's a number of other zakat calculators out there as well. Could I see a show of hands who's married? Okay, brilliant. Could you keep your hands up if you have an official certificate from the government or some government that says that you're married? Okay, good. So for those of you who didn't have their hands up but are married, then you should actively look into getting the marriage certificate. So it can be if you got married in an overseas country and you've got the nikah nama from there, you've got the certificate from there, that's fine. But if you got married here and it was just a religious ceremony, but it wasn't the official ceremony, then you've got a problem, because that is not seen as an official marriage for the purposes of inheritance. So if not for love, then at least for tax planning purposes, you should definitely get yourself a marriage certificate. Because the key tax planning that you can do in a will is that all of the money that you leave to your spouse goes to your spouse tax-free. And so that's a key move that we'll talk about in a second when we talk about some of the inheritance tax stuff. So very important that if you are married, then you make sure that you get yourself that marriage certificate. And you can do that very easily by just going to the registry office in, I think Oldham probably has one, Manchester certainly has one, and you can go in there, book in an appointment, and then off you go, and you can get yourself a certificate. They will ask you some questions to make sure that no one's forcing the other person into getting married. So you need to pick a day when both spouses are quite happy with each other, and they're not going to pick any issues between you. Okay. The other aspect to this is, and this is why I recommended going for the paid will once you get some stuff going on, some like wife, spouse, husband, children, house, etc. Because a legal professional can sometimes pick up certain edge case things that it might be helpful for you to start thinking about when you sit down and you do your will for the first time. So often what ends up happening when people come to us to do a will is there's a bunch of tidy up stuff that needs to happen beforehand. So for example, my property is held as a joint tenant versus a tenants in common. So there's two ways that a property can be held in this country. You're either a joint tenant, so you own this property, by the way, so you're not actually a tenant, this is just a legal term. You own the property with your spouse, let's say, but you're joint tenants. And that's how it's legally written down. On the other hand, you could be what's called tenants in common. So what happens in one scenario is if you pass away, your property will not be part of your estate. It will automatically, all of it will go to the other person. All of it. It's not part of your estate anymore. And that's concerning because unless everyone's religious and it's all amicable, then it's fine. But if it's not, then the spouse will get 100% of the main asset for most people. The other route is tenants in common. So you need to specify this whenever you buy a property, that I would like my property to be split X percentage each and to be held as tenants in common. So that's very clear to, you need to make that clear to your solicitor. And if you haven't got that sorted already, then it's something that can be sorted quite easily by just talking to a conveyancing solicitor, and they can fill out the forms for you. It should probably cost you a few £100s, I suspect. But that's an example of a cleanup thing that we often see when people come to us when talking about wills. So that might be one key thing. The second key thing is they might say, oh, we've got shares or we've got something, but the shares haven't been issued. Or we've got certain assets that it's not actually mine, I need to transfer it over to someone else, but I haven't quite got around to doing it. So that's the kind of thing that would be a cleanup activity that needs to be done. We might have certain situations where a conversation needs to be had before the will can actually be done. So that would be another cleanup situation. If you've got children or you've got dependents that are getting significant support from the social services or the council. For example, they may be in a care home or they may be in some kind of care facility, and because they are seen as below a certain threshold, they are seen as poor for the want of a better word, the council will look after them. Yeah? But if they end up suddenly getting a windfall of money through your estate, then they go above that threshold. And so then all of that money will then be used to actually pay for their care. So that money ends up being lost effectively to the council or to whoever. And so there are certain things that lawyers can help with in this scenario, where they can either say to you, give it to someone else that would ultimately inherit after this person passes away, and make sure that they are looking after this person, and you can do it that way. Or they can recommend that you set up some kind of trust as well, so that money is actually in a trust, and the profits from it will be coming to this person who's in some kind of care home. So these are the kind of peculiarities and the kind of specifics that lawyers can help guide you through in these particular circumstances. Okay. I think we've already gone through this, so I'm going to flip ahead quite quickly. Right. Hands up who likes paying tax. Good. Alhamdulillah. The fitrah is strong in everyone. So, funnily enough, inheritance tax is something that the majority of people, thankfully, or I guess problematically, will not end up paying. And the reason is because we are living in a society where the rich are getting richer, and we have this elite 5-10% of people who actually have all the wealth, and the rest of the society is under the nil rate ban threshold. But Muslims often surprise me. They may not necessarily be showing the cash in the bank accounts, but they've got cash under the mattresses, and they've got gold, and they've got all sorts. And so when people pass away, that's when it all comes out to the surface, and suddenly there might be some inheritance tax due. So it's worth us talking through this. And interestingly enough, the government themselves say on their own website, gov.uk website, that you should think about how you plan around your estate so that you're not paying unnecessary inheritance tax. The point of inheritance tax is not to trip up the average person. It's to tax people who have a huge estate. Yeah, so that's the spirit behind it. So we've got 40% inheritance tax. And the way it works is as follows. If you've got an estate that is £325,000 or more, you are now in the taxable zone. So if you have, for example, an estate of £350,000, you are going to be taxed on that £25,000 that is above the £325,000. And you will be taxed 40% on that £25,000. So 10,000 of that will go. That's how it works. Now there are some additional specifics, and this is ultimately not a lecture on tax planning, but I'll give you the details so that we've got enough to work with. For most people, however, there is good news, which is that if you have a property, and that property is going to be going primarily to your children, then you get some additional benefit, which are all grandchildren, which is called the additional nil rate band. And what that means is, and most people will have an asset that is their main property that they live in. Most people will. So if that is part of the estate, your nil rate band actually goes up to £500,000. So you get an extra £175,000 on top of the £325,000 that you already had. So now you've got £500,000. But there's an even bigger move that's coming, which is that both you and your spouse both get this advantage. And you and your spouse can actually transfer your unused nil rate band to each other. So in effect, you end up with £1 million, and this is why very few people actually end up paying inheritance tax. You end up with £1 million to play with that would be tax-free as long as you have got the paperwork right. And this is where a trust-based will comes in. So a trust-based will, what it does is it says, okay, you might have an estate worth £670,000 or however much you've got. And what happens is the money will go, all of the money that is above 325,000 or 500,000, whatever your threshold is, all of that extra money will go to a trust where the ultimate beneficiaries are the people that Islam says they should be, but the wife is the the life tenant. And what that means is the wife gets the income during the lifetime that she is alive. And from an Islamic perspective, the wife can then also actually gift out that money as well and make sure that the distribution is continued accurately. But from a tax perspective, what it means is you can fulfill Islamic law and you can take advantage of the main tax planning tool that is available to everyone. Because the vast majority of people that are not Muslim, when they make their will, they pretty much leave all of it to their spouse, and they might give a little bit to their kids. And then the last remaining spouse will give all of it away to their kids. That's kind of how it normally works. And so their wills are quite tax efficient, from the get-go. But because we can't give all of our money to our spouse, because we can either give a half, a quarter, or an eighth, depending on what the situation is, we don't have that luxury. And so that's where the trust-based will comes in. And this is the item number 1, which is leaving money to the married spouse. The other key thing that we can do when it comes to tax planning is gifting. So as long as we stay alive, and if we make a major gift, so something above £3,000, if we make a major gift to our children, to whoever, as long as we stay alive for 7 years after that, we have completely escaped the clutches of inheritance tax. And so if we die after 4 years, the inheritance tax actually goes down every year. So by the time we get to year 7, it's 0%. But if we die in year 6, it's still quite high. So gifting is a key tactic that we can use to reduce our estate down so that it's below the relevant thresholds. And gifting is actually something that is, I think, quite highly encouraged, and it's a great way of, in your own lifetime, you can see what's going on with your children, and you can give them what they need. And what I mean by that is that you might see that one of your children is just going to need a lot more support, because they might be disabled, or they might be whatever other reasons there might be around it. And so you can use your own money in your own lifetime to spend on them to solve that issue. So then when you pass away, that isn't something that hasn't been dealt with, it's already been dealt with. And so actually, I find that probably the most successful people, or many people, when it comes to estate planning and just getting rid of these things, they just gift everything away way before they actually get to their deathbed. And so that makes things a lot simpler for them. And what's the other thing I was going to say? Yeah. And if you are gifting in your lifetime as well, you can give it to non-Muslim relatives as well, which is another key tactic that you can use, because your inheritance laws, Islamic inheritance laws, don't apply necessarily to gifts, so you can use your discernment and your judgment. However, you shouldn't be completely unfair either. You shouldn't, completely isolate or marginalize certain people. You should, of course, be just and have your Islamic ethics about you when you're making these gifts. You can give up to £3,000 to whomever you want, tax-free, and so that can just be out of inheritance tax with no issues, up to £3,000. And then there's actually a number of other smaller things that you can do. You can give wedding gifts to your sons and daughters and to your grandparents straightforwardly with no issues. The other thing that you can do is, if let's say you've already gifted them away and you're already you want to give more, but you've already taken advantage of all the gifting things that you can do. The other thing that you can do is you can just spend on your sons and daughters, or your grandparents, or your grandchildren. You could pay for their schooling, you could pay for their travel or clothing, or whatever other things that you can do. All of that doesn't count towards the gift thresholds. So that's another thing that allows you to just gift more and more and more. Now, certain people might be sat there thinking, it's all right, Ibrahim's talking about gifting, but I don't really want to give any of my money away. I want to sit on my money for a bit, which is also understandable. And there's still some tactics there for you as well. And it's called business property relief. So business property relief, this is the stuff that if you saw on the news, Jeremy Clarkson was protesting with the farmers when there was a recent budget announced. Did you see that? Anyone saw that? Mr. Clarkson protesting with the farmers. So they were all very upset about business property relief. And this is actually something that, you know, as I think I've got older and as the Labour Party has got into power, I've actually started realizing that, you know what, at least on the tax side of things, maybe there was a point that the Tories had. So business property relief is this relief, and you might be thinking, I don't have a business. It's not just for people who have businesses. It definitely applies to them as well, but it also applies to agricultural land. It also applies to people who have shares in private companies, and it applies to people who invest in forestry funds is a classic example of this. Early stage tech companies is a classic example of this. All of these things fall within the purview of business property relief. And the way that it works is that you can put your money up to £1 million into business property relief eligible companies, and that becomes tax-free when it is passed on to your inheritors. So after 2 years of holding it, all of that money becomes inheritance tax-free, which is quite a powerful tool. And so what the government previously had was that there was no limit. There was no £1 million limit. And so there was a lot more that one could play with. And it was a get out of jail free card kind of thing, where people would put money into forestry funds or the AIM index, which is a list of companies, rather like the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500, but it's a much smaller list of companies in the UK. And you could put your money into that, and all of your money would be inheritance tax free as long as you held it for 2 years. And forestry funds was the other one, and EIS, technology companies, was the other one, EIS funds. Now, so what the government has done now is they've changed those, and they put the 1 million allocation up, and they said, okay, up to $1 million is 0%, but then after $1 million it's 20%. So it's still better than 40%, but it's now reduced down. And then for the AIM index, it's now 20% for all of your investments in the AIM index. So it's still better than nothing, but it's not as tax efficient as it was before. So you might be now, some people's eyes might be glazing over somewhat because there's too many percentages and business property relief and what have you. The punchline basically is that if you have a larger estate, if you're now, you've got your property and, you've used your spouse's allocations and everything, and you're, $1 million, and you're now heading into past the $1 million territory, there are still tactics and things that can be used very effectively for this. Charity is another great way of reducing inheritance tax, because any charitable donations you make won't attract inheritance tax, and also it reduces a little bit the inheritance tax that you pay on the rest of your estate as well. So there's a marginal benefit to giving charitable donations out, even as part of your estate, quite aside from the reward that you would get for it. And then for those of you, and I imagine in most audiences there's probably none or maybe sometimes one or two people who are very wealthy, who have estates in north of 2, 3, 4, 5 million plus, typically 5 million plus. For you, it's almost imperative that you need to talk to a tax advisor and think about how you're going to be setting up some kind of trust vehicle, because you can be quite savvy around that in a way that allows you to pay some tax now, but then actually get rid of inheritance tax for the future, and then also make sure that your kids and you are getting income out of it as well as you go along. So there's things like family income trusts is an example of one of those, and there's multiple types of trusts. out there that can be used for this kind of tax planning as well. Which is, to be honest, why a lot of people were saying that, look, Rachel Reeves, you've made these changes to the tax schemes and the tax codes, but actually those who are super wealthy will always have mechanisms to plan around tax. And these days they're quite footloose as well, so they'll just move to different countries where there's a completely different tax regime. And actually, unfortunately, without getting too political, I think the changes here are going to hit those who are probably the middle class the worst, because they're the ones who actually end up having to pay the most taxes. But yeah, it is what it is. Okay, so final story, and then I will open up for Q&A. So the final story is a crazy one where you have one of my friends, he had to travel recently to another country in Africa, and he had some uncles there, and he had some uncles in Pakistan as well. And unfortunately, again, same story. There wasn't a will done, there wasn't a distribution done, and as a result of it, there was a dispute as to who owned what. And because we're now across multiple continents, certain people in poorer countries, they really need that money. And they say that, look, you've moved to the UK, you've got a life now, you've got a job that's well paying, and I was left with this inheritance or this property, and I've been living in it, I've been working on the business, and if that is portioned up and distributed now, and it is going to be a fair amount of money, I'm just, this is my livelihood, you've got your own lives now. And you can understand where that person is coming from, but it's obviously still unfair and it needs to be distributed. And to avoid that scenario, if that person hadn't become dependent on it in the first place, when the first person died and they had distributed it fairly, he wouldn't be in that position anyway. And so what ended up happening, and the crazy aspect of this is that they're now fighting with each other, and there's a court proceeding going on as well in Pakistan. And at one point, there was a gas leak in this house, and he called his uncle up, who was on the other side of this faction, and the uncle told him to light a cigarette lighter to basically effectively blow up the house, I think. And so then when the other people found out, because this person then got quite badly burnt because he did it as well, but the house didn't blow down, then there was a fight between the two, and then the uncle ended up in hospital because he got beaten up. And this is a real life story that happened, just a few months ago. And that's all because of inheritance. And it's all because we don't place money in the place where it's supposed to be put, in the pecking order of priority. Money is just a means to an end. Money, like strength and weakness and war and peace, is just another card on the table. And yet, unfortunately, because we don't think about this dunya as just the dunya, we look at all of these positive cards on the table: wealth, money, fame, luxury, Rolls Royce. And on the other side, we've got poverty, hardship, disability, anxiety, stress, hard work, Peugeot, I don't know if that's fair. And we think of this as, we really don't want that, and this is what we want, and this is a trial, and this is not a trial, this is the blessing of Allah. And to be honest, partly that is true, but it's also it's all a trial. The rich man and the poor man, they both have equal chance, really, of getting into Jannah. And in fact, one of the people that you should be most jealous of is a rich man, because he has the wealth and he gives away and he donates from it. Sulaiman alayhi salam, when he was given the arsh, when he said that who can bring the arsh of Queen Sheba to me, the Queen Bilqis to me. And قَالَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ, the one who had the knowledge of the book, عِلْمُ الْكِتَابِ أَنَا آتِيكَ بِهِ قَبْلَ أَنْ يَرْتَدَّ إِلَيْكَ طَرْفُكَ. He said that I can bring it to you before you even blink. And then the verse carries on, فَلَمَّا رَآهُ مُسْتَقِرًا, and then he blinked. It's effectively, that's what the verse is saying. He blinked and then he saw it in front of him. مُسْتَقِرًا عِنْدَهُ قَالَ هَذَا مِنْ فَضْلِ رَبِّي لِيَبْلُوَنِي أَأَشْكُرُ أَمْ أَكْفُرُ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ حَمِيدٌ. That he said, this is from the fadl of Allah, my Lord, min fadli Rabbi, liyabluwani, to test me, if I am going to be thankful or if I am going to be one from those who do kufr, ungratefulness. And so Sulaiman alayhi salam, he saw this positive thing. He saw that as the test. And then we see the story of Qarun, where he had a huge amount of wealth given to him, but that was his test. And then on the other side, we see Ayyub alayhi salam, that he was inflicted, or we see Dhannun, we see the Yunus alayhi salam, who was swallowed by the whale. We see the story of Adam alayhi salam, who was led astray by shaitan. This is all hardship. We see the story of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam or Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anhu, who were tested physically. This is all hardship, but it's still a test. And you can end up with wealth and still end up getting to Jannah, and you can end up with hardship and still end up getting to Jannah. And it's the cards on the table, right? And that's where I think we go wrong. When we talk about mirath, of course we should sort this out, but then it's also an attitudinal thing. Like what we are doing with mirath is that we are helping people avoid themselves. We are helping people, if we do the right thing now, we are saving our children, we are saving our offspring and our inheritors the musibah or the trial where we haven't sorted it out, and now they've ended up with this luxury or this good stuff, and they think that that's it, and that ends up getting them to Jahannam. And we could actually end that by just doing the right thing now. That's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. I think if we have Q&A now, that would be great. I think there's a mic at the back on both ends, so feel free, if you just want to stick your hand up, then someone will come to you and we can take the questions. Jazakallahu khairan.
Let's start with the sister, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Just go back to when you're talking about how in Pakistan you said they had a family business, and obviously now he doesn't want to give it up because it's his livelihood. I think in a similar vein, say for example you have a family home, husband has died, you have a mother with her children, but if he still has his parents who are left behind, how does that get split up? Does that mean that she may have to sell the home, but she needs to live there with her young children? She has to give it to the parents? How does that work?
So you're asking about a scenario where there's one of the parents is still alive, and that's the family home. Yeah, brilliant, good question. So this is something that happens often, and there are basically 3 solutions to it. And these are practical solutions that need to be talked through. The first of those is that the house, if it's large enough and there's enough in it, it gets sold, and then a new house is bought for the mother or father that is remaining. The second of those is that the house is sold and the mother or father moves in with one of the siblings, with one of the kids, and they're happy. Everyone's happy with that arrangement. They may not be, right? So that's one option. And then the third option is that it is agreed that the house is going to be, this is where we go into the trust-based wills, where the mother, or let's say the mother is the remaining person, is a life tenant in this house. So what that means is she has the right to live in that house and benefit from it while she's still alive, but actually the owners of the house automatically will be the inheritors after she passes away. So that's, there's 3 ways that can be dealt with. And I'd say probably the most That the ideal scenario is that the house itself is just sold, and either a new one is bought, or the mother moves in with someone, because then that just gets the distribution done ASAP. And the distribution being done ASAP is a really important part of this as well, because the longer it kind of lingers, the more there is room for error, dispute, forgetfulness, and someone gets dementia, someone isn't able to sign power of attorneys, and then the whole thing just gets caught up in a stasis. So yeah, those will be the options, and the preferred one is to try and get this done ASAP.
Just can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
The two witnesses, can they be the two executors?
So the two witnesses can be the two executors, unless the executors, you made them the beneficiaries. Does that make sense? So if you've made your two sons the executors, they can't then be witnesses. But if you made the two executors, I don't know, two friends of yours, they can be both.
Before I ask my question, just one clarification on the gifting that you mentioned earlier on. At the start, you mentioned, rightly so, that whoever inherits, regardless if you like them or not, it's their right or their haq for that inheritance. But if I understood correctly, the gifting is while the person's still alive. So if they start gifting away their wealth in order to spite someone that I don't want them to inherit anything, would that not be injustice? So because they're still alive, they can do whatever they want with the wealth?
It's a good question. So this is where when I said that Islamic ethics would be an important part of this. Islamic ethics would, I think, dictate that you should try and be just even in that scenario. Like, the laws of inheritance don't apply to this gifting because you're not passed away yet, but you should still be just. Islam says you should be just between your offspring, you should be just between your spouses, you should be just between the different people that you have in your circle. What you can do, sometimes people do this because they have particularly strong feelings about someone who's walked out on them or whatever the case might be. What they do is this: they put it in, this is the Islamic inheritance, but then they make a request in their messages to the loved ones at the end, where they say that, they can sometimes say quite, if you fear Allah or whatever, then don't take this money, kind of thing. But you can do something along those lines as well if you particularly want to send a message, but that's non-binding and they can still take it.
So for the clarification, my actual question was going to be, if you have a business and that's an ongoing thing, but the person that started the business didn't leave a will behind because they weren't aware of the Islamic ruling behind it, but when one of the children is actually actively running that business, and when it comes to the inheritance side, they've split up the shares, but in order for them to, let's say one sibling says, I want my share, but the only way of giving that is by selling the business, which means then they'll lose their livelihood, and the siblings are not willing to. Are they forced to sell the business then?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. It's one of those where it just needs an adult conversation with all parties at the earliest possible time that we can get to, and the earliest possible time is really before even the first person passes away. Now I appreciate that's already under water under the bridge. The second possible time is now, where the person whose livelihood it is, they should know that, of course, this is their money, and it's no good having money that you can't get access to. There's no point in that. It's like effectively not really having that money in the first place. So we need to have a pathway to them getting the money. That has to be the case. So there is no right answer to say to them that, look, just trust me and you'll get your money eventually when I exit the business. I don't think that is that's fair on these people. But what can be done is you say that, okay, look, you've got 1/6 of the business. This is my cash flows. This is what the plan is over the next 5 years. What I can do is I can slowly start buying you out. Or what we can do is a portion of the business can be sold. Or what we might all agree to is that, look, we're just going to work on this for the next 5 years, and then we all agree that we're going to sell this, and then it's done. So something that's constructive, but there's no, Islam would say they need their share, and they need it as soon as possible. Those are the two guiding principles. After that, it comes into practicality and trying to solve it.
Assalamu alaikum. I've got a question. As an unmarried woman, there's no husband, there's no children. She has a mother, father, 2 sisters. There's a significant amount of money and a lot of assets that have been earned. These are not inherited. Who would her inheritors be? She's already set up a trust for the money, but has no will. One of the sisters is estranged as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, off the top of my head, I'd need to do the calculations, and you can very easily do that. Instinctively, I want to say that the mother would get 1/3 and the father would get 2/3. But this is actually where there's a bit of a difference of opinion sometimes in the actual fiqh itself. So I would double check with the calculator, but then I would also double check with a mufti that you trust and is according to your madhab, and then follow that.
Assalamu alaikum.
So in that scenario, again, this is off the top of my head, so I could be wrong. I don't believe they would.
Regarding the guardians, like Islamic ruling is that the guardian can take a fair amount of money if the children are less than 18 years, and then he can take care of them. How to accommodate that thing is the law, like in the will.
Oh, so you mean as in a guardian is looking after the children and he's looking after their money as well?
Yeah, or he's just looking after the kids, but as per the Islamic rulings in the Quran as well, he can take some fair amount of money which he can spend on his family and for him. That's as right. Well.
Yeah, so there's no, you're talking about the verses in, I think it's Surah Nisa from memory, and you're exactly right. So they should take from that which is appropriate. I think the word, I can't remember the exact words that are used just now, but they should take from that which is an appropriate amount, but they shouldn't do dhulm, is the injunction from the Quran. And so, if we think about that practically, what does that look like? Well, you could probably work out, just looking online, how much it costs you in particular, but then also generally in the UK to look after a child. Yeah, and there might be certain things that you're paying for them, like tuition or schooling, whatever other things you might be paying for. So that's discrete amounts of money that that you're paying for them, and that would be, I think, fair for you to take. But then money on top of that, I think it wouldn't be fair for you to take. So this would be part of. So you are their guardian, and you get their portion of money. So this is a good question actually. So what happens if you're giving money in your inheritance to people who are under the age of 18? So it is their money. It is Fara'id, the 6-year-old's money, but you might be looking after them. So in order for you to, because Fara'id doesn't have a bank account, so the guardian will look after Fara'id's money for them. So it's Fara'id's money and it's in a bank account that's looked after by you. And so from that bank account, you can take what is just. But this is also why the Quran mentions it. Because as you can imagine, Fara'id, bichara, he's 6-year-old, he's got no idea what's going on. This is why the Quran specifies specifically to be very just, because they're the most vulnerable in society, because they're completely under the guardian's control, and they have no idea what's going on. And so this is where we just need to be just.
Yes, thank you. If I've understood you correctly, it's inconsistent with Islamic principles to have owner property as joint tenants rather than as tenants in common. And if that's the case, and say somebody passes away and left everything to their wife, but they had other relatives that Islamically would have inherited from them, what should happen now? Should the wife try and make good what the husband didn't do Islamically? Is that the solution?
Yeah, so if you've got a joint tenant household and everything is amicable, right? Everyone is completely on board with we're going to do this the Islamic way, and you're very comfortable with that, then you could potentially even leave it as joint tenants, and on the knowledge that everyone knows what they're doing. But to just take that off the table, it is better to shift it to tenants in common, because that just clarifies everything. And decade passes after this conversation, when they actually pass away, and in that time, dementia's kicked in and people have forgotten things, right? So tenants in common is better, but I'm not saying it as like a blanket statement you should never have joint tenants, because that's also something that people have, and it can be sometimes difficult to change it. If you've got a mortgage on the house and you've got other charges on the house, it can be complicated. Now, coming to your question specifically, if the wife has inherited all of the house, then she should 100% from her Islamic duty, she should distribute that out. It's not, in Islamic law, you can't just take a major asset and just say that this is not part of the inheritance. It is part of the inheritance, and it should be distributed pro rata to the shares that the Islamic inheritors should get.
Just a sister. Yes, sister.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to understand what you said about a non-Muslim children inheriting from a non-Muslim parent. There is a family of a father, a mother, 5 children who are all girls. The mom was all alive, a Christian, until on her deathbed when she tried to pronounce the kalima. The daughter told her about it, she could mention it, and on that point she died. Now the inheritance, everything the mom left behind, the children, from the understanding that, okay, mom tried to pronounce the kalima, now we can say she's a Muslim, and then they said they have the right to properties. So I want to understand from what I heard from you today, is that right for them to have done that?
So the mother, we understand her to be Muslim, and the children are not Muslim. The mum was a Christian, and the children are Muslim, and the mother became Muslim on her deathbed? Okay, so I mean that it is what it is, right? So so we should understand her to be Muslim, and therefore all of the rulings would apply for what a Muslim, how a Muslim inherits.
Thank you. You gave the example for the £100,000 and then you divide by whoever, wife or mother or gets it. But it's like, if you have like as an asset, not like money. So let's say someone who left is with car, some property and all those stuff. So in those scenarios, they have to sell it after the death and then give the money, or how it will go in that scenario where you have a combination of cash, asset, car, might be some money here and there, and property.
Yeah, it's a great question. Usually these items, they're not worth very much in monetary amounts. You might have some gold, which might be worth a fair bit. You might have some cash, which might be worth a fair bit. But then the clothes themselves and the car usually isn't worth that much. Sometimes the car is worth a lot, right? So then you need to think about, okay, well, this is actually it's valuable. Probably the cleanest approach is to take the non-valuable, almost like sentimental assets, and they're basically worthless, from a cash perspective. And, I know my mother-in-law, for example, wants to give specific, clothing to specific people, and there's no kind of issues with that. They can go ahead and do that. But when it comes to, let's say, her gold, or some larger, chunkier assets, she's got a very old car that probably isn't worth very much. So I don't think it's like a material thing to worry about too much. But her gold and her cash, and of course property and shares, all of that definitely needs to be part of a collective pot that then gets distributed out. But taking in abstract your question, is there might be certain items that are not fungible, they're not cash, or they're not something that we can easily sell, and is an asset that we don't particularly always want to sell either. What can we do with that? So there's basically 2 or 3 logical options. The first is that you sell it. The second is that you say, this is how much it is worth. It's worth £1,000, and you, brother or son or daughter, whatever, you were going to get £1,500. So why don't you take the car? Is everyone happy with that? Yeah, we're happy with that. Why don't you take the car and take this 500 on top? Off you go. So you can do it that way. Or the third way is to say, and this is usually only applicable to property, or if you happen to be the owner of the Kohinoor or some kind of diamond, or the Picasso or something that you want to just keep in the family, then you would say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put shares. So you have 1/3 share, 1/3 share, 1/3 share, and we're all happy. We're not going to sell it. Okay, fine. Let's just keep the asset and keep it as it is.
If a person passes away and at the time of his passing, his inheritors, example, his mother was alive, but his estate was not split out immediately, and after a while the mother passes away, and now it's been decided to split his estate, what happens to the mother's share that she would have got at the time that she was alive?
Yeah, great question. So what would happen is that the mother is deemed to have received her portion, and then Islamic inheritance would just apply again on the mother's portion. And so it's as if she has received it, and then they distribute it out again.
Assalamu alaikum. Just a question regarding taxation and, well, not avoidance, but planning. So if you've got a property and it's worth a certain amount and you're over a certain threshold, is there a form of trust that you can recommend would be better to put that in there and have beneficiaries, and from that perspective you can then have a will based on that accordingly?
This is not your residential home?
It would be a residential home.
Oh, right, okay.
And if you had other properties as well?
So the residential home, from a tax planning, and this is under $1 million?
Probably, you would say, maybe around that figure.
Okay. I mean, in London, this can happen quite often. So with the residential home, as long as it is $1 million or under, then it's better to give it to the family and just keep it in the personal name, because you're going to get up to $1 million, of which 350,000 of it is going to be from this additional nil rate band. So I talked about 325,000 gets topped up to 500. That 175,000 for both the spouses becomes 350,000. And so that 350,000 only goes if it's a residential house in your name and you're giving it to your inheritors directly, so there's no trust or anything involved. So that is kind of taken care of. In addition to that, if you've got other properties, that's where, okay, you now need to think about how you're going to do it. And this is where I think thinking about trusts would be quite helpful. As I said, this is probably slightly beyond my pay grade. It's worth you having a chat with tax advisors on it. And normally the kind of things that they recommend is some kind of family trust, family income trust, or some kind of other discretionary trust. And what happens with a trust is when you pay into the trust for the first time, there may be some kind of tax that you have to pay at that point, because it's a kind of crystallization of profits, or it's a, it's like it's a sale that's happened. But then any growth within that becomes effectively tax-free, so it's part of this trust. And income, you can set it up so that you can still benefit from the income during your lifetime. And there's different types of trusts out there. And as I said, beyond my pay grade. So there's some tools that you can use for that. What I would say is that if you have an estate that is north of probably about, I'd say, 2 million probably, then it's probably worthwhile having a conversation with a tax advisor. Under that, you could well still have a conversation with a tax advisor, but because they're going to charge several thousands of pounds to give you the tax advice, it's only normally worth it once you get past 2 million or so. Under that, doing a bit of DIY or having some informal advice is usually a little bit cheaper in that kind of, no man's land of 1 million to 2 million.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is in regards to the 2-to-1 ratio of sons to daughters. If, for example, a daughter was struggling quite financially and you exceeded that 2-to-1 ratio with your remaining 1/3, is that permissible?
As in you are giving to the daughter, but you want to give the daughter a little bit more.
Yeah, on top of the original 2-to-1.
Yeah, so this is we covered this in the talk. You can do that, but it needs to be with the permission of all of the other beneficiaries. And if any one of them disagrees, then you can't do that.
Quick question. You mentioned earlier that you can give 1/3 of your inheritance to charity. Would that then require the expressed permission of the other inheritors? No.
That's yours to decide.
Grandchildren whose father had already passed, do they receive any inheritance from their grandfather?
Grandfather, so the grandchildren have passed. It's a good question. I think it's one for the inheritance tax calculator. Instinctively, I want to say that it will feed through. Because it's the father, so it's the son, his portion would feed through pro rata, and then it gets split up 2-to-1 between the grandchildren. But I could be wrong. It's one to check with the VAR.
Assalamu alaikum. If the father has 6 children and he transfers the property to 3 of them, and without telling the other 3, and when he passed away, the other 3 found that everything is the 3 named. So from where actually, because this is quite common scenario in our countries nowadays as well, so where actually, what's the response from Islamic point of view for the one who has inherited and the one who hasn't inherited?
Yeah, great question. And this is, another one of our relatives is currently living this particular situation. Ultimately, it depends on what was the intent of the father. Like, was the intent of the father to gift the money in his lifetime to these 3 kids? Or was the intent of the father that he just wants to put it in their name because it makes it easier to manage after they pass away, and then it's better to have multiple people on the property, but actually they are holding it on behalf of all of the family. So there's 2 different intents here. And so a qadi or the families would need to sit down and figure out what is the correct understanding of the situation. Is it 1 or is it 2? If it's 1, he's just gifted it to the 3 of them, then it is what it is. If it's that he has actually given it to them in trust, then they have the responsibility to make sure that everyone then gets the rightful amount. There is also a twist to this. There's Islamic Council of Europe, which is a fatwa council. I don't know if there's other fatwa councils up north here as well, but they deal with these kind of situations. So if everyone is willing, they can actually turn up and the qadi can decide that for them. And the final thing I would say is, if the property is the main asset that the father had, this is like 95% of the entire estate, is a big chunk of the estate, then the qadi may say that, it is fairer to split it up between all of the parties. Because, if all of the inheritance then is effectively because of this kind of gift that was given, and, the father was, potentially then being unjust in this scenario, the qadi would then, use his prerogative and say, look, no, actually, you need to split it out amongst all parties. So yeah, there's that's the kind of conceptual framework to think about it.
Hello. Just a quick one on workplace pensions and when it comes to inheritance tax, because I'm not sure you covered a lot in your seminar, but for the workplace pension, should that actually be down as an asset within your will? And also you have beneficiaries for a pension anyway, so does that need to reflect in the will as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I should have looked into it or covered it. Before Rachel Reeves came along, workplace pensions were typically seen as outside of the estate, and they would just go directly to the beneficiaries directly. Now, Islamically, of course, that should be seen as part of the round. So it's it's like the same thing with a joint tenant property. It comes through to a one person, and that's that's good from a tax efficiency perspective, but and it's usually the spouse, but that then should be distributed according to Islamic law, full stop. After Rachel Reeves's changes, I mean, I can't remember off the top of my head, but what I think she has, she's basically introduced a portion of it that is now going to get taxed, with inheritance tax. And I need to look into it, to be honest. So from a tax perspective, I believe that you might need to make some slight tweaks to it. You might want to, draw it down further so it kind of finishes in your lifetime, as opposed to leaving it, lingering. Or you might want to get some kind of, that TBC in my head, but the other side is clear.
Assalamu alaikum. One of the questions I'd like to know about is, we know everyone uses it. It's called asserting who's the actual owner, milk. So obviously that becomes quite difficult after one passes away. We also have a very convoluted way of doing tamleek by under someone else's name. Is there a framework or a tool that can be used to make sure that we can ascertain who's the actual owner and also keep it covered, because that's what it's really done for, isn't it? Tax purposes whilst alive, not after. So is there any tool, framework that is available which we can use to help people with that, ascertaining tamleek as well as making sure it's legally legit and within the tax threshold? And along with that, obviously the second part would be Islamic inheritance would include every asset that is owned. How deep do we go? Would that mean, small items that is owned, clothing and stuff? Do we actually need to go to that level, or is it just primarily big assets that are worth something?
Yeah, so the last one is, I think what the brother asked as well. I think if it's under a certain, let's say it's under a couple of £1,000, I wouldn't worry about it too much, because it's, it's not very material. I would just deal with it as, sentimental kind of items. In terms of the first point, I think the cleanest way to do it is through a will. So, in your will, you actually write down all of the assets that are under your name, but then also in the messages to the loved ones, you can clarify that, at least to your mind, this asset that is under the name of your son or daughter or whoever should be part of the estate, and you can give your nasiha on how they should then deal with that. The thing is, unfortunately, we often govern our affairs, as you've rightly pointed out, in a very convoluted and complicated way, and that just makes the whole thing even more complicated. So if you are going to do some mad tax planning like this, then make sure that you write everything down and you're overly clear to everyone as to exactly what is going on, because this is precisely the kind of thing that then causes dispute, because the son was gifted this when he was 14, and it's not really clear in his head what was going on, and the father never really told him, and now he's 55 and the father's passed away, and time has passed, things have changed, stuff has happened, people are in the house, out the house, and so it needs to be completely crystal clear, written down somewhere and revisited, and also not just written down, communicated to the people that this is, what I've said is, what I've written is what you understand. Do these three things match? And if they match, that's how you avoid dispute. Even better, try and avoid crazy tax planning like that in the first place.
Assalamu alaikum. So I just wanted a bit of clarification regarding gifting when you write in your will. So I think you said you can gift up to a third, and then obviously the rest is to be distributed however. So in a situation where there's a family and say 3 or 4 children, all under 18, maybe one of the children is disabled, so maybe the father is thinking putting a certain percentage as a gift for the disabled child for her care, right? So in terms of the consent of the other beneficiaries, is that required? It's still a gift, right? But she's also a direct beneficiary as a child. So how does that work?
Yeah, there's probably 2 ways that you can do it. One is you can gift to the child in your lifetime and just set that money aside for her specifically, i.e. you could set up a ISA or a junior ISA or some kind of account where you say this money is hers and I'm just kind of investing for her. The other way is that you put your wishes in the will, but until you, as you rightly pointed out, until the kids whose rights are up for grabs actually gain the age of maturity, they can't opine on it, and so it would need to remain in the in the letter of wishes that the guardian would be looking after all of this anyway, and then once they all get to the age of maturity, then it would be a question for them to face and then answer.
I think this could be last question.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. 2 questions. One is, if I gift a property to 3 of my children and it's a rental property, the income that comes from it, can I still take that, or does it have to go to them? So question 1. Question 2 is, if my intent is to have 3 children and a wife, so if we all own 20% of a property, could I, as an intent, my intent is that, could I write that on my will as well?
Could you do what, sorry?
So if I say I have a property and there's 5 of us in the family, my wife and 3 children, and I say that my intent is that each one of us own 20% of it, is that valid as an Islamic point of view?
Yeah. So so let's deal with the last one first. The answer to that is yes, because that's, this is in your lifetime. You can do whatever you like. The first one is also yes, because you're gifting to them, and you can set whatever criteria you want onto the gift. You just say to them, look, this is for you. It's in your name. Capital is yours, but in my lifetime, I want the income, and that's the nature and the the understanding behind this gift. No issues.
There's a sister here. Last question.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. I just wanted to ask if a father has estranged his children in his lifetime and he remarries, and within his lifetime he writes off or gifts everything to his second wife. He passes away. Can the children still claim his inheritance or not?
They have a legal right to the father's estate. The problem is there is no estate. So it's probably one for a qadi to have a look at, but the reality is, if we're talking about this country, I'm not sure how far he would get unless the new family and the new beneficiaries were wanting to play ball as well. But if they're not wanting to play ball, then it's an unfairness, unfortunately, and they're probably just going to have to live with it. Jazakallah khair, everyone.